Today we're going to learn how to use the extruder, which is this tool that is wall mounted next to me in the classroom. And the reason we use this tool is to extrude different shapes out of a solid block of clay. There are two main options that you might want to consider. These are the dies or patterns that you put into the extruder in order to extrude out various different shapes. You can either extrude solid shapes, which are typically smaller on the smaller dies, or smaller openings within the dies, and you can also extrude hollow shapes. The difference between the two dies is that a hollow shape will only have one larger opening in it, and you'll also see that it has an incised area here where you have some additional parts that you will need to be putting together. The solid shapes, typically there are more than one of these. A lot of times there are 4 different shapes featured. So I'll talk about the solid shapes first. Next to the extruder on this cabinet, on top of this cabinet, this countertop, lives a box titled Extruder Parts, which has other parts in addition to the dies that you will find housed on this holder that's located on the wall. So the dies slide up into this holder when you're finished. These additional parts, there are a variety of different things here. For the solid dies, if you, for example, only wanted to extrude one of these shapes, you can combine this die with this flexible rubber piece to isolate the shape that you want to extrude. Notice that there is a front and a back to the die. This is the front, or I should say the top, and then this is the bottom part. The main difference between these two is that there's a little inset, almost like a funnel, and that should go upright so that the clay comes down from this direction. If you are putting the black, let's call it a selector, if you're putting the black selector over the top, it needs to rest on top of the die and not underneath it. The clay is going to be coming from the top this direction, and while the selector here is blocking 3 of the selections and allowing clay to flow freely through one of them, the clay is going to come out at quite a bit of pressure. So if it presses into this hole, it will put a lot of pressure into this flexible rubber part. You might get clay squeezing out of areas where you don't want it. So make sure this goes on top if you don't want clay coming out of all 4 holes. There are a couple of solid dies that have just one hole, like this would produce sort of like a ribbon shape. And again, notice that there is a funnel area. This is where the clay should be coming into, and then this is the bottom of the extruder die. So it should be situated like this, upright in the machine. So let's go ahead and put this die in place, and I'm going to go ahead and allow clay to come out of all 4 of these holes. Let's say I just want 4 options for these sort of strings, or I guess you could call them coils, that are going to come out of the extruder. There are a few other parts that you need to source from the extruder box to do this. One is a big metal part, and this will go on the bottom of the extruder. It is connected to the bottom of the extruder with these 2 heavy-duty bolts, and it is connected by putting the bolts in from the bottom up, and you'll have to actually twist them so that the threads catch on the threaded portion of the extruder here. So these are hex bolts, and you do have a hex key here that you can insert to the bottom of the bolt and allow yourself to basically twist those into place. So the way that you're going to set this up is whatever die you want to go into the extruder, you're going to place it on top of this bottom portion of the extruder, and then you are going to put, if you are using it, you'll put the black selector here on top of that extruder die to select. I'm not going to use this, so I'll be setting that aside. All right, so here we are at the extruder, and you can see, well, I guess you can't see on this side, but on either side, there is a mounted threaded nut, I guess, that is attached, welded to the extruder itself. So I'm going to hold up the bottom of the extruder with the die on top of it, facing up. So I'm going to hold one of these big chunky bolts, thread it up through the bottom nut, and just twist it with my hands a little bit to allow it to start to catch on the threads of this upper threaded area on the extruder. I'll do the same thing on the other side. So that's just enough so that this is holding. So that's holding in place, but it's very loose. This is the point in time at which I want to use the hex key, and I tend to like to use the longer end of this. I'll plug it into the bottom of the bolt and then just start turning it until that's tight. Now, when you've attached that, you want to take a look around the entire piece of equipment to make sure that there are no gaps between the metal part of the extruder and the die. You should be doing this hand tight. You know, you don't need to totally crank on it, but just know that if you have a little gap there, the clay is going to come out at an immense amount of pressure and it might squeeze out of that gap. So make sure you try to tighten that up. All right, so the extruder is set up with my die tightened into the bottom of the extruder. We are ready to push clay through this machine. Now, the first thing you want to be aware of is that this has a very long and heavy arm, and it swings quite wide. So if you're facing the machine, make sure you just check in the area in front of you and warn anybody who's working around you so that you don't end up knocking anybody in the head or the face. We're going to swing that up really high, and then you're going to take the plunger out of the extruder, and then you can lower this down. That will allow us to put clay into the extruder. It's roughly square shaped. It's kind of about 4 by 4, and then you've got maybe 6 or 7 inches of depth to it. That's the maximum amount of clay you can put in the extruder. You can use clay that is fresh out of the bag. You do not need to wedge it. When you buy clay, it has been de-aired. So you have a low chance of getting air bubbles in your extrusion. If you're wedging clay, that's perfectly fine as well. I just suggest that when you take the clay to the wedging table, you kind of pound it into a symmetrical block that is about 4 inches by 4 inches wide, maybe a little less, so that it fits easily into that space. I have a block of clay here, and this is pretty fresh clay. Instead of wedging it, I'm just going to cut a solid block and then go over to the extruder, and I can put that clay into the extruder and push it out. One more step that is optional is that you can take some vegetable oil spray, and it does live on top of here on that this area where the dies are held, and you can spray the interior workings of the extruder. That typically helps create a little bit of a release between the slick metal part of the extruder and the clay. This will not harm your clay. It's an organic material. It will burn off. It does, if you spray it, you need to be careful about how much you get on the floor, and be careful that you will then have some oil on the floor and it will be a little bit slick and slippery. So just be cautious about this. Again, this is optional. You will have to clean this machine. It does take some cleanup. So this is just one extra step that might help you with that cleanup. I'm going to go ahead and spray just a little bit along the walls. I'll then insert the clay block, drop it down in there, swing the arm wide, place the plunger inside there, And do know that you're going to need to use a pretty considerable amount of force to get the clay to come out of the extruder, especially if you're using unwedged clay that is not terribly soft. So as I'm really feeling the clay engage with the extruder, I'm putting a lot of force on this. I'm putting the force of my weight on it. You could even get somebody to help you. This is wall mounted pretty securely on here. If you feel anything wiggling that shouldn't be wiggling, please tell me about it because we'll need to fix that. All right, and I wouldn't say that I absolutely maximized the amount of clay that could have gone in here, but I put a fair amount in. And I allowed for all 4 of those holes to extrude coils. And then you just want to carefully take those off and put them on a board and then go ahead and work with them. Just know that the extruded coils are mainly things that you should be using for decoration. They don't have an extreme amount of structural stability in the same way that rolled coils do, because when you are rolling them, you are compressing them. To make clay stronger, you always want to add compression. All right, so I've taken all of my usable clay off of here. It's time to remove the plunger. Keep in mind that it might be suctioned in there pretty well. There's usually about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of clay left. So that's about the amount of clay that was left at the bottom of the extruder. So you can see that not very much clay actually stuck to the die because of that vegetable spray that I sprayed in there. So that was kind of helpful. Because I'm using the same color clay for this next extrusion, I don't need to clean everything out yet. I can clean it out after I complete my project. So next, there's a slightly different process when you're setting up a hollow extrusion. When you're looking at this die, you have a couple of extra parts to consider. One of them is this placeholder. And what this does is allow you to put a centerpiece, a sort of blocker, which allows for this to be a hollow extrusion. Most of them are colored blue, just like the color of the die itself. We have one replacement part here for this particular extrusion that's a slightly different color, but functions in the exact same way. I'm going to show you the blue piece because you can see it a little bit better on screen, that on the part of it that goes on the upper part or on top, it has a little indentation where it will fit onto this piece. And it also has a horizontal linear indentation, but then it has that little funnel aspect that's very similar to the solid extruder die. So the first thing that we're going to do is to slide this part here onto the what do we call this? I don't know, the metal placeholder. I guess there's no real good word for this. The little horizontal slit on it should lock into place on this raised area on the metal portion to prevent it from turning during the extrusion. And then there is a threaded part of this rod, and you're going to use this wing nut and tighten that down until it is secure. You don't need to overly tighten. I'm going to go ahead and put this white circle or clear circle onto this metal part because it corresponds to the shape that I want to extrude. Okay, so then the next thing that you're going to do is make sure that the metal zigzag part is facing up, and you are going to fit this metal part into the corresponding grooves that are on the extruder die. And what it's doing right now is it's forming an area in here where the clay is going to come out. The center part of that clay is going to be blocked, meaning that part will be hollow. And you can see that there's a little funnel area both on the central part that you just attached to the metal and also on the main part of the die. And the clay is going to have a little bit of an extra width because it will be essentially cut by this metal part, and then underneath it, it will come back together again so that the shape that you extrude will be a hollow pipe-like form. That's the bottom of the extruder. So when you put this together and put it on the extruder, it's very similar to what I just showed you with the solid piece. You're going to put this whole operation on top, and then you're going to take the bolts and screw them into the extruder part. So that's all right, so that's secure and it's ready for some clay. I'm going to give it just a little bit of a spray with that vegetable oil. And the result is that I have a hollow tube of clay. Now, one of the most important parts about using this equipment is to clean it all up. You have lots of threaded metal instruments included in here, lots of places for clay to get stuck and jammed in, and makes it far more difficult to clean afterwards. You also have two different types of clay used in the studio, darker clay and lighter clay. So please make sure that you're kind to your classmates and you clean out the entire machine. That involves taking this apart, taking all of these portions over to the sink, cleaning them out, possibly using a needle tool to extract clay from some of the indentations. If you see any clay on the threads of the bolt, please make sure that gets cleaned out as well. And then making sure you get a sponge where you clean out the inside of the machine and the bottom of the stopper as well. Then make sure all of the dies go back into this holding area and all of the other extruder parts go into this container. This is an example of an area that easily gets clogged with clay that you should use a needle tool to clean out. When you're all done, make sure to lift the handle up and place the plunger fully inside the extruder. Please also make sure that you are never propping the plunger and leaving the handle elevated in the air. If this slips and falls, this cracks somebody on the head and cause some serious injury. So push that inside, let that plunger go down. And lastly, make sure that you also clean up any clay scraps or any oil spray on the floor.